Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for all of you who are joining us. We have our online participants. Thank you so much for taking time to join us, and those of us who are in the room. This is a hybrid event, so we are online, and we are also very much present physically from Nairobi, Kenya. We welcome you to Wild Animal Protection, the first of one of the main events that we do, bringing us together, the media, our stakeholders, the digital team, to really launch reports, to sensitize people, and to create awareness about the importance of animal welfare. Before I proceed, we'll play a video about who we are. And then for the online audience, so that you know, this is a very short program. We are looking at 1 hour of a presentation by Dr. Victor Yamo. And today we launched the report about the climate change and cruelty, revealing the true impact of factory farming. That will take approximately 45 minutes. We'll have a session for Q&A. So for those who are online, please do type your question on the Q&As and on the comment section. You can see it. It's now open for all comments, all suggestions that you might have. Please do type them there. We will take all those questions at the end of the presentation. So let's play a video about who we are.
At World Animal Protection, we know that every animal counts. We're a global animal welfare organisation and have been campaigning for over 50 years to end animal cruelty. We work to achieve global change. Every day, billions of animals are experiencing unbearable cruelty. We tackle the root causes of their suffering so that we can make the biggest difference to their lives. We give a voice to the voiceless. Our world is changing fast. As people face urgent issues like the climate emergency and depleting natural resources, we give animals a voice and ensure their needs are met because we all call our planet home. Right now, we're prioritising issues where change can transform the lives of the greatest number of animals, overhauling the global food system. And ending the cruel exploitation of our planet's wildlife. We know that the fate of animals' lives rests in our hands. Our passionate teams inspire and mobilise individuals and organisations to create change. We support local and global movements that are fighting for a better future for animals. Our knowledge and expertise give us a powerful voice at the most influential levels of government and business, where we establish animal welfare as a global priority and a local concern. Though the challenge is great, our determination is greater.
Thank you. Indeed, we are World Animal Protection, and the challenge is greater, but we are also strong in our deeds and in our determination. As we proceed, please keep this conversation going. Our Twitter handle is @MoveTheWorldAF. We are very big on Twitter, and we would love that you join us in spreading the gospel. So our Twitter handle is @MoveTheWorldAF, and we use the hashtags Change Lives Forever. We use the hashtag Change Lives Forever. On all other platforms like Facebook and Instagram, we are World Animal Protection Africa. So please look us up and join these channels, Facebook, Instagram. I hope, I know most of us are on Instagram. Get us there, and so support by commenting or even joining or taking an action. We have a number of petitions on those platforms that we would want you to be part of. Go in and sign the petition. But for now, the Twitter handle is MoveTheWorldAF. We have social medias here. We'll be tweeting as our speaker speaks, and we will be tagging @MoveTheWorldAF, and the hashtag is Change Lives Forever. At this point in time, I invite our Director for Africa, Tennyson Williams, to do a keynote address.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lucy. Good morning, friends. Morning to you. Thank you very much. So I want to join Lucy in the first place to welcome all of you. It is interesting, important, appreciated that we have a mix of media practitioners in the room today, because as an organization and given what we focus on, we are very clear that this is not something we can do alone. As you may know, but if you do not, our vision says we want a world where animals live free from cruelty and suffering. That is a mouthful. It is aspirational, but as it says, it's a vision. We believe we can realize that. But our mission says something in relation to that vision. And it says, we move the world to protect animals. Friends, it is important we appreciate that that vision cannot be realized by World Animal Protection personnel alone. And hence we say we, which involves all of you present in this room and our friends who are online around the world witnessing this very important event today. We have been around for many years. Our experience is premised on over 50 years of hard work and belief and conviction that we deserve a better world, you and I sitting in this room. Let me share that last week I was privileged to be in South Africa, participating in the South Africa Society for Veterinary Epidemiology and Preventive Medicine, where for the first time, that body requested that animal welfare is part and parcel of the agenda that they will be pursuing going forward. In other words, animal welfare, friends, is here with us if it was never, and it's going to be with us forever. Because, as I have said before, I think this was sometime in 2014. In Africa, for example, our development aspirations will never be fully realized until animals are part of the solution. And we owe no apology for making those statements because it's just real. So as media practitioners, as humanity, the fact that we are at crossroads, evidenced by coronavirus, evidenced by floods, evidenced by all manner of things, the nexus between our welfare as human beings and the welfare of animals, the welfare of the environment is a reality. We cannot ignore that. And there are several things, efforts, documentation, scientific research that point to that reality. Talking about scientific research, today, we are going to evidence through this effort one of the first studies that have ever been conducted on the face of the earth to make a connection between animal agriculture and climate change. This is the first, and we are proud to be a pioneer institution when it comes to things like this. We are being bold and brave in that reality, but we appreciate our limitations, which is reflective of the need for us to have a very strong partnership. The media is critical. The message needs to get out there. People need to be aware. We are in a fast-changing world, and that's the reality. Given our 50 years plus existence and experience, we have to make tough choices. We have had to make tough choices. When the Africa office was re-established in 2013, and I took over as country director with a brilliant team of Africans, we are doing a fantastic work. The organization itself, in its evolution, has had to make tough choices. We used to have in our program frame 4 program areas. We were talking about farming animals, animals in communities, animals in disasters, and animals in the wild. But we took a bold step to write a new strategy that will last from last year to 2030. Friends, in this strategy, we zero in on 2 goals only up until 2030. Goal 1 is about disrupting the global food systems. Because of the billions and billions of animals, mainly pigs and broiler chicken, that go through those production systems in their billions. And the cruelty and suffering that you find in those production systems, you don't want to be part of, because it is just terrible. The second goal is about the fact that out of our own greed as human beings, out of ignorance as human beings, we use animals as commodities. And we say that should stop. Why? Animals are sentient beings. Like you and I, like what the poets have been saying since I came into the room, displayed on this monitor, animals deserve a good life. So from 2021 to 2030, we have made that tough decision to focus on those 2 areas. That is not to say we have fixed the problems when it comes to animals in disaster and animals in communities. For example, dogs and rabies. All of you here will know that rabies remains one of the most serious problems facing humanity. But we had to make that choice. So how do we bring change for animals? You might be interested to know. As an organization, without any apology, we have come to the realization that because there is so much ignorance, there is so much greed, etc., we need to educate and mobilize. We need to educate and mobilize seriously on a consistent basis, relentlessly, because there is serious lack of education when it comes to animal welfare and our dealings with animals. Some of us feel that this is God-given, it is our right, we should use it the way we want. Fine, but don't forget, what goes around comes around. What goes around comes around. Africa is hosting one of the biggest global events this year in Egypt, the climate conference. Africa is at the receiving end of climate change, but Africa is the least contributor to that problem. That is the reality. Floods all over the place, droughts, we're losing our animals, we're losing our livelihoods. We cannot wait. We can't wait. You and I cannot wait. We need to take action. So we need to educate and mobilize. We need to lobby and advocate. It's not enough to educate and mobilize. We need to lobby the powers that be to change our rules, our policies, to make them animal welfare compliant. Last but not least, we need to catalyze sustainable solutions. things that we have tested and they have worked. We need to replicate them. So to summarize, the way we bring about change for animals is by educating and mobilizing, which is what we are doing. We have done a research. We are launching that research to work with you to get the message out there that it can no longer be business as usual. We need to lobby the powers that be, competent authorities within countries to bring new laws to bear. When you arrest somebody who violates the Animal Welfare Code of Conduct, the police officer must know where in law that person should be charged. Because many a time the police officer will tell you, where in law can I charge this matter? I can't prosecute this matter because there is nowhere in law. We need to catalyze sustainable solutions. What are the low-hanging fruits that have been tested and proven to work? So without further delay, I want to join Lucy again in welcoming you. We are going to be launching a pioneer study report, Climate Change and Cruelty, revealing the true impact of factory farming. The true impact of factory farming. Make no mistake, we are very conscious that Africa, for example, is food insecure. We know that. And we are also part of the call that Africa should be food self-sufficient, but not at the expense of the welfare of animals. There are better ways to do that. Not at the expense, because, as I said, what goes around comes around. The welfare of animals and the welfare of humanity are inextricably linked. That's a reality. What we do to animals, what we do to our environment fights back. And we have seen evidence of that, where the environment is fighting back and humanity stands to lose. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I want to say we look forward to a very engaged launch event. Those who are online, please journey with us. We are very pleased that this is happening. It's a pioneer, a groundbreaking report, a groundbreaking study. We need to go to Cairo in November and present a new argument to the climate change discourse, which has always been from an energy dimension. This year, for the first time, we want to put on the agenda of the climate discourse an argument that links animal agriculture and climate change. Thank you very much.
You can do a better hand for Tennyson. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Tennyson, for the keynote address. And at this point, I want to welcome Dr. Victor Yamo. Dr. Victor Yamo has years of experience. He's a veterinary doctor, and he works as the campaigns manager for our food systems program. Please give him a welcoming applause. Yeah. Thank you, Yamo. I stay down. I think you should stay down.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I think mine will be, I don't want to say brief because I'm now holding a mic. But what I'll try and do is to take you through highlights of the report, Climate Change and Cruelty, revealing the true impact of factory farms. And for those who like autos, ninasemanga hivi that that's important, the most important slide you'll see today in this presentation, because it has a name, a contact, and email address, so you can easily send us questions and allow us to engage beyond this space. You know, I teach in an academic institution sometimes, and people at this age tend to forget things. So you're allowed to get back to me. So without much ado, it's good that part of what I was going to do has already been done based on the clip that you saw, and then Tennyson has also made quite some presentation around it. So that's our vision for those who can't see what is down here. A world where animals live free from cruelty and suffering. And that is our mission. We move the world to protect animals. And I think mine is just to lay emphasis on the word we. It's not about wild animal protection staffers, it's about all of us driving that process. For those who have not read the Constitution, for those in this room, the Constitution of Kenya actually puts animal welfare into. So it's a part of the responsibility of what we need to deliver. I can see interesting looks when I say that. We can discuss. Then Tennyson has also alluded to the fact that we have a new global strategy that runs from 2021 to 2030, a new world for animals. And it would be nice if you can get, when you get the slides, there's a link at the bottom where you can actually access our global strategy. And the strategy then, as Tennyson alluded to, gives us 2 goals, and I'll be referring to them in the main presentation at some point. Goal 1, which is to ensure farmed animals live good lives by transforming the global food system. And that is what I do or look after. And goal 2, which is to stop wild animals being cruelly exploited as commodities by changing the systems that allow it. And there's an interface that we'll be discussing later on as we go through the presentation as part of what the research looked at. That was my first introduction. So the second introduction. The second introduction, I think where we need to start is from factory farms. What are factory farms? So that we are all on the same space. Because the moment I talk about factory farms, those of us who come from the bigger Nairobi metropolis, you quickly remember that your neighbor has a farm, a chicken farm or a pig farm. Those are not necessarily factory farms. Factory farms are essentially a system in which many animals, and when you say many, it's a lot of animals. If you remember what invited you, there's a picture there. That's what we are looking at. A lot of animals intensively being raised up in that production system, confined and often overcrowded, under very controlled conditions. Yeah, if you look at the developed world, you have pressure ventilated, temperature controlled chicken houses. In Africa, we are still predominantly dealing with naturally ventilated, open-sided chicken houses, which then doesn't qualify as factory farms. So in our understanding and in our estimation, in the research we've done on this country, in this country, there's very minimal factory farms in Africa, but there's some down south and a bit in the north. And so that is why we are looking at it. And I think at some point, somebody asked me, why then are we talking about factory farms if it's not there? From an organizational perspective, the idea is to limit factory farms from coming into Africa. As we go through exhibitions and as we visit various spaces, we are beginning to see early signs of factory farms moving into Africa. We are seeing things like farrowing pens. We are beginning to see in certain spaces in Nairobi where pressure ventilated or environmentally controlled chicken houses are happening, which then is increasing the number of chickens that can be kept, stocking density in the chicken house. The reason why we are looking at this is because factory farms are not sustainable, predominantly for 4 reasons. 1, they lead to deforestation because we need to clear large tracts of land to be able to grow feed, soya or maize that goes into the feeding animals. So that's one thing that, again, you'll see later in the process. They also use a lot of pesticide and chemicals. Pesticide to grow the crops that are used for feeding these animals, and chemicals in the production system, which then contaminate the environment. And then a lot of those factory farms then give you a lot of waste products, manure. What you do with that manure becomes very difficult. And in most cases, if you are a good African like me, most likely you're using that manure to grow crops. If that manure is contaminated by pesticides or antibiotics or disease-causing organisms from this production system, then essentially what you've done is you moved the problem from the chicken or pig house into the environment. And last but not least, factory farms, because of the number of animals that we're keeping in them, is actually driving antimicrobial resistance, because farmers have then discovered that part of masking poor animal welfare is you prophylactically give animals antibiotics or antimicrobials to prevent disease occurring. And so that's something that we are critical. Factory farms are also very destructive. They rely on appalling animal suffering. And remember that we are talking about minimizing cruelty. and they cause a lot of misuse of planet resources that we'll be looking at later. They have certain unacceptable practices that we look at. Close confinement is one of them. So in broiler, close confinement would look at stocking density, a lot of animals in one enclosed space. And I think COVID has taught us that social distancing is critical and important in disease management. Close confinement in layers would look at, again, things like battery cage systems that we are, again, certain organizations have started to say shouldn't be allowed into certain spaces. Animals are then also growing very fast. And one of the challenges that we're having with broiler production is that the chicken is growing too fast. And there's already internationally discussions on slowing the growth rate of especially broiler chickens. We wean these animals earlier. We don't allow them to be weaned at the appropriate step, and that then causes certain problems. The environment is poorly ventilated. You end up with a lot of respiratory problems. And then as the photograph shows there are other routine things, debeaking, teeth clipping, tail docking, that are very painful. And sometimes we do them without considering that the animal feels pain, and it leads to certain process. So that's in a nutshell what factory farms looks like. To then get into this discussion, we then need to look at production. How much are we eating and who's eating what? So briefly, what we're saying is that currently, looking at 2018 data that has been analyzed, we have about 80 billion animals consumed globally. Out of this, the biggest, the most consumed animal, again, is depending on what you're looking at. If it's in terms of numbers, individual numbers being counted, then the most consumed animal is chicken. We are talking about 70 billion chickens consumed annually. To make it simpler to Kenyans, we are talking about slaughtering 2,000 chickens every second during the process. But if you're talking in terms of weights, and I know Beryl is here from Farmer's Choice previously, the most consumed animal in terms of weights is pigs. So please let's understand that that question tends to give us a lot of problems, because when you ask which is the most consumed animals, there's usually a debate. It depends. If you're looking at weights, pigs is the most consumed. If you're looking at numbers, individually counting 111, chicken is the most consumed. By 2030, we are projecting that Africa meat consumption will rise by about 30%. Asia and the Pacific region will go up by 18%, Latin America by about 12%, and North America by 9%. So generally, we are saying we will continue eating more meat. Yeah, and drivers of this include things like urbanization, the fact that you're having more informed people, the middle class is growing, especially if you look at context, people like in Kenya, where we have 47 capital cities, because each of those counties has a capital city. So that urbanization is driving consumption. And then, of course, aspirational. Ukifika, in Kenya, we say you eat meat, you stop eating vegetables. And that then has nutritional impacts that we need to look at. It's projected that by 2030, the beef consumption of beef will go up by about 5 or 6%, pigs by 13%, chickens by about 17%, and sheep by about 16 or 15% or thereabout. So this is what is driving factory farms and influx of factory farms into Africa, if we want to talk about Africa, because we need to feed a growing population, which is estimated that currently we are about 1.2 billion people. By 2050, we'll be about 2.4 billion people. We literally will be doubling the population of this continent over the next 20 or so years, 20 or 30 years. So essentially that then brings us to the discussion. What are the impacts of factory farms? There are certain things that we're looking at, and those who have been engaged with us in this debate or this discussion, you've heard us talking about effects of public health, antimicrobial resistance, superbugs. We even launched a report on superbugs on supermarket meat testing some time back. We're also looking at a lot of animals suffering. When you're talking about intensive farming, especially factory farms, there's a lot of suffering. Those animals are squeezed. They don't even have space to move around. In fact, we say for broilers, the broiler enjoys more space when it's in an oven than when it's in the chicken house. And that is something that is very critical for us to understand. It also undermines food security, because poor animal welfare leads to an animal that's unhappy. An animal that's unhappy will have depressed production. Depressed production means you're not getting your optimal production, and that means you are not able to get as much out of the animal as you expected. So there's a connection there that we also need to be looking at. And of course, finally, it also looks at biodiversity loss. We are clearing large tracts of land to grow animal feed products, soybean. And those, when you clear those tracts of land, essentially you are then losing the biodiversity in those spaces. You are clearing habitats for wildlife, and essentially then you are losing a lot of biodiversity. And then of course, we've talked about pollution in terms of manure, yeah, that's contaminating these environments from the production systems, and that then drives that process. But today we want to concentrate on the it drives climate change, because I think that's a connection that a lot of us have not looked at. We have essentially been concentrating on the other driver, the other impacts, but today because of COP27 happening later this year on this continent, we then want to look at impacts of climate change. We then go back to the two goals that I talked about earlier on. Goal 1, which is about ensuring farmed animals live good lives by transforming the global food system, and Goal 2 that looks at stopping wild animals being cruelly exploited as commodities. The nexus or the connections between the two is that feed production then impacts on or is done on spaces where wildlife should have been. And even in Kenya, I think for those who've been looking at some of these things, you can remember at a point where somebody was trying to grow avocados in what turned out to be an elephant corridor. So that's the kind of thing we are looking at. We are clearing land to then grow inputs that go into the feed production systems. By clearing land, we are then starting to release carbon into the atmosphere, which then leads to climate change and drives that process. But research done by Food and Agriculture Organization shows that food and agriculture contributes to about 26% of greenhouse gases. And it's done in 4 or so ways. One is around the supply chain. When you look at the energy that you're using to transport that food, when you're looking at the packaging process, the processing process in the slaughterhouses, that energy has an impact of climate change that contributes to about 18% of the 26% that food contributes. The biggest contribution comes from livestock and fisheries, the whole production system, and we'll be looking at where it's coming from, and then from the crops that we are growing to feed the animals, for that matter. Factory farm is, in fact, factory farm or livestock agriculture is the largest global source of methane and nitrous oxide, which are greenhouse gases that we need to be aware of. But when you narrow it down, and we just want to look at, again, something that FAO has put in one of their products, and the link is there for you if you want to read more about that. Essentially, we are saying that between dairy cattle, beef cattle, pigs, and chickens, you can see the numbers in terms of carbon-related emissions. And that is where we need to start concentrating, to start realizing that what we thought is a production system that has no impact is actually driving climate change, especially across the globe. But what exactly is bringing this climate change? There are 4 areas that we need to look at in terms of livestock production systems. One, as I said, is the energy consumption in processing, in transportation, which accounts for about 5%. The feed itself, by just clearing and growing that crop, you're already releasing carbon into the atmosphere, and that contributes to about 41%. The enteric fermentation in the gut of the animal contributes to about 44%. That's where methane essentially comes from. And then manure, and processes around management of manure contributes to about 10%. So holistically, and I'm sure EAC kama ile IEBC, it adds to 100%. There's no 0.1. Yeah, it's 100% for sure. Yeah. Again, you can check from FAO, the website. So now let's look at what the report actually says. And I'm sure, again, Evans and Co can give you a copy of the report after this, because it was embargoed until yesterday. The research did certain things. One was to compare the environmental impact of conventional factory farms with impacts of industrial farms with higher welfare standards. And we as World Animal Protection are not saying that we shouldn't produce animals. We're just saying there's a better way of doing it. Animals should be produced looking at what we call FARMS, Farm Animals Responsible Minimum Standards. And again, we can give you links to what FARMS is all about, so that we were trying to compare those two systems. We also measured the impact of human diets containing less chicken and less pork. And then we combined certain scenarios to model climate change and environmental impacts with when people eat less and better. And we are not saying you stop eating meat, we are saying eat meat, but eat better quality meat that is coming from high welfare production system. And then around that, we did projections of climate impacts in 2030, 2040, and 2050. The research was done around what we are calling the 4 factory farming giants, or the 4 factory farming hotspots, which are basically China, Brazil, United States of America, and Europe. But Europe, we then took one country, the Netherlands. Again, the reality is that, as we said, there are no factory farms in Africa, but we are modeling some of these things so that Africa can start addressing the issue way in advance, so that we also prevent influx of some of what we are looking at from coming into Africa. So based on that, we then looked at animal feed production, the production system that looks at crop cultivation, whether it's soy or corn, how it's transported, how it's processed. After the processing, some of it is taken overseas, especially if you're looking at places like Brazil, which is one of the biggest producers of soy, into other production systems. Then we also looked at the farm animal level itself, how the feed is mixed, what kind of rations the animals are eating, what aspects of animal husbandry and the farming itself that is there, and what comes out at the end of the day, the manure and how that is managed, and the harvested products that then gets onto your plate. Essentially, then those are the parameters around where the modeling was done. From that, the findings of the study was that when you look at per capita consumption, kilograms per person per year in 2020, maybe I should ask the people in the room, how much meat do we eat per person per year in this country? Okay. Anybody wants to give a hazard? I guess for those guys online, you can put it on the chat box if you have a guess. Yeah. Essentially, Africa, so that we then see the differences. In Africa, the average consumption of meat total, when you take chicken, pigs, sheep, goats, everything, is about 15 to 16 kilos per person per year. Globally, we are looking at about 86 kilos per person per year. So you can see the disconnect. But if you look specifically at the top line, talks about pigs, and the second row is looking at chicken. So you can see a place like Europe, we are having about 56 kilos per person per year. In China is about 40 kilos per person per year. In the US, about 74 kilos per person per year. So we are saying the two animals contribute to about 135 metric tons of greenhouse gases per year, which is equivalent to 29 million cars on the road for a whole year. So that's what we're trying to address. And that is the challenge that we need to start addressing. We need to start having a position, even as we go to Sharm el-Sheikh later in this year in November for COP27 meeting. When you then look at the percentage of methane gas just coming from manure, and specifically pig manure, it's about 21%, between 21 and 24% across the 3 or 4 countries that we are talking about. And methane, which is a greenhouse house with the highest potential for warming up our climate, is one of those gases that comes from that manure. Currently, around 113 governments have signed a pledge to reduce methane emissions by 30% by the year 2030. And those are part of the discussions that we are talking about, the Paris Climate Agreement, COP27, 28, or whatever COP we will be looking at, because it's an annual conference. And again, we've provided the link where you can look at which country has signed. I think it would be interesting to see which African countries have signed into that process. Part of the findings is the fact that the biggest climate change and environmental impact for factory farms comes from production of crops for animal feeds. And that's why we are really trying to look at that nexus around animal feeds and where that feeds are being grown. One of the things that happens is because of demand for feeds, and especially in Africa, where maize is used for human consumption and we want to feed it to cows and pigs, that challenge, and you know what happens in maize in this country, is part of the reason why then there is that drive to clear forests so that we grow more feeds for human consumption, but also for animal consumption. That deforestation causes carbon to be released into the atmosphere when trees are cut down, and that essentially starts your journey around climate change, and you can realize what is happening in Africa for that matter. Just to give you an example, for 10 kilograms of chicken that comes onto your plate, it is estimated from the research that we clear about 4 trees. And for 10 kilograms of pigs that comes onto or pork that gets onto your plate, we clear about 5 trees. Now, I don't know, for those of us who do the calculation and remembering the rallying call that we need to plant a tree for everyone that you cut, you can see the disconnect and the challenges that we have, and maybe part of the reason why we don't have adequate forest cover in some of the countries that we work in. Production of feed crops also utilizes a large amount of water. And remember that globally, the planet is water depressed. And so we need to start looking at how then do we manage some of these processes so that we ensure that production is sustainable and we get food in a sustainable way. The current practice is not sustainable because it is estimated that 90% of water that goes into pig production system is actually for growing feed crops that are needed for feed production system. The production system also pollutes as we grow the feed crops because we then put in manure, we also then put in fertilizer and pesticide, which then ends up contaminating our water bodies. And that then gives us challenges in terms of production. So beyond climate issues, there are also environmental impacts that we need to be looking at. Then we are using land to grow crops to feed animals that will become our food, which is a highly inefficient system. For every 100 calories of crop that you feed to farm animals, you only get 17 to 30 calories reaching humans. So it's 30% efficient. The thought process now is maybe it's time for us to rethink and reconfigure our production system so that we grow crops that go directly into food production systems. Giving you good examples, meat and dairy provide only 18% of overall calories, and it's good. My good friend Mercy from Health and Nutrition is here. She can confirm the figures. And it only gives you 37% of proteins for humans, but uses 83% of your farmland. In fact, the interesting thing, 2 or 3 years ago, when we went to a county nearby to do a research and to engage chicken farmers, some of the chicken farmers that we knew were there had already quit. And they tell me it's easier to put up a flat and collect rent than to grow food. And those are some of the things and discussions that we need to start having as Africa. So essentially, we are saying it's better to grow crops or plant-based diets for direct human consumption. But if we then have to do production systems for animals, then it has to be a high welfare animal production system. We then modeled, as we said, around looking at what if we consumed 50% of the meat that we consume? And therein, we need to strike a balance, because when you're talking from the third world, Africa and Asia perspective, we are saying that we still need animal proteins, and it's important that we have them, but we are saying we then need to look at eating a production system that produces high welfare products that then are sustainable. But if you're looking at the developed world, the hotspots of factory farms, then we are saying we need to reduce. So remember that Africa is eating about 15 to 16 kilos per person per year, but Europe and the developed world is consuming about 86 kilograms per person per year. So they need to be less consumed at that level and slightly to improve what is there. So we are saying if you reduced consumption of meat by 50% by 2040, then what you're seeing there is the figures, the percentage reduction of climate change impact. Yeah, so for instance, in the Netherlands, if you just reduced pig consumption by 50%, we are looking at reducing climate impacts by about 54%. And you can see the rest of the figures, which is significant because we'll then be having, we will be able to meet our commitments around Paris Climate Agreement of reducing climate or maintaining temperatures at a certain level by certain times. When you go further and say beyond just reducing consumption, you then add 50% high welfare. Then you're saying that by 2040, we would be, remember that when you say that climate change is contributing to about an equivalent of 29 million vehicles. If you did that in the 4 countries, then we are saying you would be reducing climate change by about the equivalent of 45 million cars running around for a whole year. So those are very interesting figures. And that's why as an organization, we've come out to say, let's start having that climate change discussion around some of these things. So what are we saying we should do? And what's our responsibility as consumers, as government, as industry? Because it's not just about talking about it, but what action do we need to take, even as we prepare for the conference and even beyond COP27, as we look at climate and impacts of climate. We are saying that in our research, we found that a 50% reduction in consumption of chicken and pork by 2040, plus a 50% adoption of higher welfare products leads to a sustainable and kinder future. Remember, we are custodian of natural resources for the future generations. So it shouldn't die with us. This planet has to persist before that. So we're asking consumers to start choosing to eat less meat and better meat. So you need to start asking yourself, where am I going to get high welfare produced products? And is industry in that position to start having high welfare produced products? As an organization, we work with producers, we work with retailers, we work with the whole value chain to drive that process. And we can confidently say that there are organizations, and later in October, we'll be launching what we are calling the pecking order, which will show which organizations have made which commitments around production of high welfare products in their systems. We're also asking you to join us to call on governments to stop approving factory farms, especially in situations like Africa, where these innovations are being moved from elsewhere to this country. A good example is battery cage systems. They have been stopped. They are banned in Europe, but what are we doing? They're coming into Africa, and in Africa, they're also coming with funding. So a farmer can easily go to a bank and get battery cage system and funding or credit to use that production system. But the world is saying that by 2036 in Australia, 2026 in certain areas, they're saying we no longer want to buy eggs for battery cage systems. So the question we need to be asking ourselves, is that production system sustainable? And if it's not, what do we need to do? Interestingly, in countries like Kenya, we have developed what are known as national climate actions or nationally determined contributions. In Kenya, it was done in 2017. I think the challenge is that some of these things are developed, but the general population doesn't know. So there are commitments that as a country we have made around managing climate change. And they can be found in the nationally determined contribution in recognition of factory farms' climate impact. And that is something that we need to sensitize industry on, sensitize people on, and government needs to have a policy that clearly states certain things around climate change as we go forward. In terms of industry, we need to support industry to ensure that they start implementing FARMs or farm animal responsible minimum standards as a minimum, because once that is ingrained in the production system and the production system is sensitive to it, then we are ensuring that the animal welfare is catered for and production then becomes better and you get high welfare products that then drive that process. That we also need to support industry to end deforestation in terms of looking for animal feeds and feed products at that level, because we've seen clearly that production of animal feeds crops is one of the big ways that climate change then comes into the equation. We're also hoping that by 2040, that we will halve the production of animal proteins. And that is something that the discussion worldwide, because when we reduce production by 50%, consumption will ultimately follow that level. And then, of course, trying to ensure that we phase out sourcing of monocrops like soya as feed for farmed animals by 2030. So those are some of the commitments that have been made, that industry is beginning to have the discussion, and we hope that by sensitizing you, you can be part of that process. We are currently running a petition that is geared towards the African governments to put a moratorium on factory farms. And I think this is an opportunity for you to then engage with that process. With those few remarks, I want to say, in a nutshell, that's what we are looking at. You have opportunity to be part of that process. And I would want to invite Lucy, who will drive the next session of getting questions and comments and feedback from that presentation. Thank you.
Indeed. I think he deserves a better clap. Want to do that again? Thank you. We are what we call makofi a kilo. So thank you, Dr. Yamo, for that. We appreciate the presentation, very eye-opening and indeed enlightening. I'm sure we all feel the same. Enlightening, new things, yeah? So we have a couple of questions, and we will start with the people who are online. And again, I want to ask the people who are online, there is Q&A. Please put the questions there. Thank you for all of us who have sent their email address. We will send the press kit and the presentation to you right after this. For questions, Victor, and I think there is another mic somewhere. If we can have that mic up here. We'll start with the online questions, then we move to people who are here physically. So do prepare your question. You can write it down and we can have it here so that Victor can answer. Victor, we have a question from Joshua Gishwa. Joshua Gishwa, how do we reduce the suffering of animals on routine procedures like debeaking, teeth clipping, tail docking? Should we use anesthesia? There's a question on debeaking, teeth clipping, tail docking. Should we use anesthesia? That is a question from Joshua. Victor, you want to take that?
Yeah, if there's no other question, I can take one. But if there were, I could take three and do them together. I want to thank Joshua, Dr. Ngiswa, since I know where he is and where he comes from. Yes, the standard practice is that we need to look at alternative methods of doing some of these things. And in certain situations, we have also found that some of those processes are unnecessary. They cause unnecessary suffering for the animal and they add no value to the production system. And that is something that we need to look at. In terms of, for instance, if you're looking at things like tail docking and teeth clipping in pigs, if the pigs were given opportunities to play, yeah, because if you remember the fundamental freedoms, one of them is to allow the animal to express its natural behavior. If you put them in groups and give them opportunity or toys to play with, then their attention is moved away from the other animal and they will not bite each other's tail. They will be looking at other things to do. Beyond that is also looking at some of the things we talked about in factory farms. Is the spacing enough? Tail backing or these vices come because the animal has not got enough space, and that then causes a bit of stress and the animal then starts biting each other. If you can do the processes earlier, and for instance, now in the poultry industry, which I'm conversant with, we are able to do debeaking at the hatchery just immediately when the chick is produced or hatched. You're able to do debeaking at that point using new techniques like infrared technology. That way then the animal is, the nervous system has not developed much enough for it to feel pain. And it's a simple process that can be done. Handling the chicken while you're doing debeaking when they are older is a challenge. First, just putting them together is stress. Then finding them to then debeak them properly is also another difficult process. But we're also saying it is important, and for other animals and other procedures, that considerations should be made to give painkillers at certain levels. Thank you.
Okay. Question from Aro of Abuja. He asked, how does battery cage affect welfare or contribute to greenhouse gas emissions? And then the second part of the question is, which is better for raising layer birds? What is your recommendations on raising layers, as we call them here?
All right. Yeah, for Anonymous, who has asked what is factory farming, I think I explained what factory farms is. Factory farming is essentially intensive farming system that has a lot of animals put into a small space, essentially in a climate-controlled or a climate-controlled environment where the animals literally don't even have space to move around. They don't have enough space to cater for their fundamental freedom, especially freedom to express their animalness, and also freedom for comfort, because one of the freedoms is about freedom from discomfort, which is about giving the animal enough space for it to be able to express its naturalness ultimately. So that's what we say. And that's what I said when I started off, that factory farms are something that is beginning to come into Africa. It is not already in Africa. And I think I would like to leave it at that. In terms of Helen, Africa bears the brunt of climate change, yet we contribute very minimal to climate change. And yes, you're right, the perennial drought that we see in northeastern Kenya and parts of Africa, and flooding at certain levels, we've had flooding in parts of Southern Africa, are all part of the differences in climate change. We are also, for those who are slightly older, we also know that the traditional seasonality that we had, where we had a long rain, I've clearly defined long rain season and short rain season, is something that we are no longer seeing. Temperatures have also become very, very shifty. We have in Africa nowadays temperatures that go as low as refrigeration temperatures. And simultaneously, for those who watch EPL, you can see footballers are being given breaks in the middle of a half because at certain levels, the climate is too hot to even play football. So those are some of the things why we are saying and why we have that COP27 or COP26 meetings, because we still need to ensure that climate change is addressed, and we need to look at all the contributors. And that's why as an organization, we are saying part of the problem is coming from factory farms, and we need to look at that from that level. For my friend in Nigeria, Aro, who's asking about battery cage system. Battery cage system is essentially a very animal welfare unfriendly production system. It's a system where you're having 3 to 5 birds, depending on how big they are and the size of the cage, enclosed in a cage for all their production cycle, about 1.5 years. Essentially, one of the reasons why we say that a battery cage system does not meet the fundamental freedoms, especially freedom to express natural behavior. For those who have watched chickens, chickens are supposed to be able to perch. In that enclosed space, they cannot perch. Chickens are supposed to be able to flap their wings and to stretch their wings. That's part of their exercising that then makes them chickens and makes them happy and improves their productivity. They're not able to do that. Because of the enclosure and the fact that they're too close to each other, there's a lot of mental stress. Remember social distancing? And all these things, when you put them together, it leads to a situation where the chickens even have challenges with their own health. Because they're too close, they tend to end up having respiratory problems, which then is masked by ensuring that the farmer then gives antibiotics so that the respiratory problems are not a problem. And that's why we say as an organization, poor welfare uses a lot of antibiotics to mask the poor welfare in that system. Beyond that, those chickens, because they are not allowed to exercise and they're not allowed to get out of that battery cage, they end up with very brittle bones. And for those who are in layer systems, even the people who buy old spent hens do not like layers from battery cage systems, because even transporting them to the market, you end up with a lot of fractures from those old birds because they've not exercised, calcification has not happened properly. And that's why globally, people are saying that by 2036, we need to have gotten rid of battery cage systems across the continent. Which is better? If you measure likes with likes, and I know when you talk to farmers, a lot of farmers will tell you that the battery cage system is better, but they are comparing battery cage system to a poor production system. The best way to compare the two is same site, same management, two different houses, one with battery cage systems, one without. You'll quickly realize that battery cage system chicks underproduce by between 3 to 5% during their life cycle. So essentially, when you're propagating battery cage systems as extension staff, you're essentially telling the farmer, or the farmer has agreed, that in their production cycle, they'll lose between 3 to 5% eggs. And if it's a business, that's a significant loss. So our recommendation as World Animal Protection is we need to do production in deep litter systems where the birds have opportunity to walk around, it can stretch, and they're able to have that pecking order that then doesn't cause disruption in production systems. Thank you, and back to you, Lucy. I think I've dealt with the 3 questions that was asked.
Thank you. Now we go to the room. Who has a question? We have a question there. And then you pass it over.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Clive Ayuko. I represent the Whistling African, which is an online news portal. From the report, I can actually see your report is titled "The Climate Change and Cruelty, Revealing the True Impact of Factory Farming." No, I read a report by United Nations Environmental Program, The Age of the Anthropocene, released some 2 years ago in 2019. And it talks about animals also actually contributing to climate change. You have the farm animals like the cows, which actually produce methane, which is perhaps even more worse if you compare to carbon dioxide. So I don't know if your report actually also touches on this. And from your presentation, you mentioned something on phasing out of soybeans and perhaps some limited amount of perhaps farm animals that someone should keep. I don't know if this is in line with the climate change agenda that you're talking about. Yeah, so if you can address this, what are your particular views on cows and the climate change agenda? Thank you.
Thank you.
And perhaps the final question, do you think that farmers should have some form of certification, like some ISO, International Standards Organization certification, to actually make them actually in line with this climate change agenda? Thank you.
Thank you. My question is just a follow-up on the battery cage system. That you mentioned that by some European countries are banning it, yet it is coming into Africa. Why then are governments allowing this to happen? My other question is just a clarification. There's somewhere you mentioned that for every 10 kilos of chicken you eat, 4 trees are cut. Is it generally does it also apply to us Kenyans, or it's a global thing? Thank you.
Okay, for Clive, yes, it's interesting that you talk about UNEP. This year in Nairobi, Kenya, there was a conference called UNEA, United Nations Environmental Assembly, that happens every year. And one of the things that UNEA came up with was there's a connection. In fact, the UNEA 5.2 resolution talks about instructing the Director General for UNEP to work in close collaboration with FAO, World Health Organization, and World Organization for Animal Health to look at the nexus between animal welfare and planetary health. To look at the nexus between animal welfare and public health. And so essentially, the world is beginning to realize that, and I think there was a slide there that talked about impacts of factory farms, and we then highlighted some of them. Public health is one of them. Climate change is another one. Loss of diversity, and that's where UNEP comes from, looking at it from that perspective. So essentially, all these things are interconnected. Poor welfare is driving challenges in public health. It's generating superbugs, which are antibiotic-resistant organisms, and as an organization, we've even done research around that. Poor welfare is driving environmental contamination, and I've given you a good example, manure from production system. If it's contaminated with antibiotic residues or chemicals, it then has a negative impact on the environment. And maybe later in this year, we'll be launching some piece of work we've done with Kenya Agriculture Livestock Research Organization, looking at some of these impacts. So essentially, we are talking about the same things. When you get my slides, you will see what you are calling carbon dioxide is written carbon dioxide equivalent. And even in the presentation, we talked about factory farms being the biggest contributor of methane and nitrous oxide. So there are a series of greenhouse gases. It's just a standard way of equating them. So UNEA or UNEP is talking the same language that World Animal Protection is saying, that there's connection between some of these things that we need to be looking at. In terms of certification, maybe I should ask you to talk to Beryl, who was in Farmer's Choice. But there are certifications, and certification depends on what you're looking at. Now we have certification around animal welfare. Yeah, there are even ASO standards around welfare. Organizations, retailers, producers in this country are beginning to be evaluated around some certification process. What we then need to do is to then drive it so that all of us are clear. When you go to the supermarket and buy a piece of chicken, there are certain things that are on that chicken package that I think most of us don't look at. You'll find a mark of quality from Kenya Bureau of Standards. What is that about? That's part of a certification process. You'll find something around Bureau Veritas. What are they looking at? Those are the things we need to interrogate as consumers. And that's why we are driving the process of telling consumers, you need to start finding where high welfare products are being sold so that you can drive that process alongside us. So there is certification, it's just that we have not taken time to sensitize you about it, but they are there. Agatha, battery cage system is coming to Africa. Africa has always been the dumping ground for anything that Europe doesn't want. The most, or developed world doesn't want. The most unfortunate thing is that in this case, they're even bringing it with money. And so if you look at our strategy, we are talking about fairer finance. We are starting to ask ourselves, can we follow the money? Who is funding what in Africa? Are they funding the correct production system? Or are they funding a production system that is not sustainable at one level, but is also going to give you challenges? Yeah. And the challenges we are talking about is if a supermarket sitting in Nairobi, Kenya, one of the fastest growing supermarkets in Africa currently, has stated that by 2026, they will not be accepting eggs coming from battery cage system. Are we funding a production system that even locks us out of the high value markets? Those are questions that we need to discuss. We are the same people who elect these fellows. We need to hold them accountable so that they give you the right policies and the right regulations in place. But part of it is what we are trying to do, and that's where we engage you, and that's why we say that the we is very important. We have a role to play. When Lucy calls out for a petition, if you go to our website now, there's a petition to be signed. If you're not signing that petition, Lucy cannot go and tell government that the Kenyans are saying this and this and that. So that's part of why we are saying the way is important. That's why we work with the general public. That's why we do this presentation to sensitize people. And it's not, the petition is for across Africa. So any of us who are anywhere in Africa, we are collecting signatures to take to Sharm el-Sheikh to say that factory farms needs to be relooked at. And I'm sure at the end of this presentation, Lucy and her team will be giving you a link on where you can sign that. When I talk about 10 kilograms of chicken, 4 trees are cut. That's a global picture. And we are looking at it from a global perspective. It's a mathematics that has been done. Maybe in the Kenyan context, it might be less or higher. Just like the consumption, when we say the average person eats 86 kilos per person per year, you find that in Africa, we are not eating 86 kilos per person per year. And that is what you're looking at. So those are global figures. Part of our responsibility as World Animal Protection, and we do a bit of research, is then to convert these global figures into African figures and find some of these figures. So there's a series of research pieces that we are working on that will give us better figures as we go forward. Thank you.
We have a question from the room. Then after that, we'll transition to the questions that are coming online. But if you also have a question, you can just write it down. We will have 2 rounds. So we'll take a question from the room, then we go online where we have 2 sets of questions that Dr. Am will be addressing. Yes.
I have one question. or concern, and then others will be comments. Thank you for that good presentation, well articulated, and the research that has brought the hidden picture of what the world doesn't know. My concern is we are advocating for consumption of meat that is of high welfare. But then looking at us Kenyans, how affordable is that? If I go to a supermarket and see a canned chicken, which I tend to think because of the regulations that have been given to them, the animal has been raised under a high animal welfare circumstances. It's a bit expensive than if I pop into a local butcher and I find a chicken there. So how sustainable, how affordable is that to a common person outside there? And then we're seeing a lot of consumption of meat, health-wise, which is not necessary. Actually, a day you only need to eat 30 grams of protein, not necessarily the meat, but we have so many other types of protein. So then we have a nutrition literacy knowledge gap that we are consuming so much of which that we don't need. Actually, 30 grams is the size of a matchbox. That is what you need to sustain you for the whole day. So then we have that gap of knowledge that we need to bridge. We need to tell people that we have other sources of protein, not only meat. So then, and again, we make them available for the whole public to access to that. We have to deal with production. Now that we're changing from meat to other protein sources, so we have to engage people who are producing that one, and then we have to deal with consumption. For example, if you pop into an eatery place, there are places you can go and you cannot be able to access a protein and a plant protein source in that place. So we need to advocate to that. We need to talk to eateries and the people that are coming into it, that we have these other sources. Then we have other ways of making protein available for the whole public, like fortification. We can fortify the commonly consumed food, and so that the public can be able to get that protein that we want them to get from the meat. Yeah, so having talked that, so then that opens an opportunity or a way, an approach of using a multi-sectorial approach. As an organization, I love the way you're talking about. That brings in the nutrition research side of it, bring in the Ministry of Health. Production brings in the Ministry of Agriculture and all that. It's a conversation that can go on and on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mercy. This is why it's good to know people from other ministries. And that's why as an organization, we're also saying it's time for us to work in a one health, one welfare approach, where whatever is happening in the Ministry of Agriculture has some linkage to what is happening in the Ministry of Health, and also to what is happening in the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment. And so I know as an organization, we've worked with other partners, and this country now has a One Health strategy that we need to be part and parcel of delivering, which is also going to create at the county levels what is known as County One Health units, and something that we need to be alive to. So those are things that we need to look at. I want to agree with you, our affordability is an issue, but we have done another piece of report that we launched a bit earlier in the year called The Hidden Health Impacts of Factory Farms. And one of the things that that report clearly states and shows across the world is that we have 1 in 4 people are overweight or obese, and it's costing us a lot of money. So the question is, we need to balance. Are we going to just ignore the high cost of high welfare products, or is it, and I personally prefer to talk about cost effectiveness. Yeah, what are we saving when we use high welfare products vis-a-vis the current situation where 1 in 4 people are obese, and it's costing us, if I remember the figures well, close to about $600 million per year globally to just manage that process. So that's something that is important. Of course, high welfare products also are going to mitigate against certain things. We've talked about in this country, and we've seen it, having super bags in products. And 2 or 3 years back, we bought meat from supermarkets and isolated super bags in 30% of the products, chicken and pork. Super bugs are essentially organisms that are resistant to 3 or more antibiotics that are used for human health. Again, what is the cost effectiveness of that system if we can get products that are clean and have no such thing? So you're right, Mercy, it's some discussion that we need people to get engaged in. It's work that we need to do at certain levels. Some economics has been done around it, but there's still gaps, especially from the African perspective, that we need to be looking at. It's interesting, and today at least I've learned something, that I only need to eat meat the size of a matchbox. So I'm going to look for a matchbox, and I'll be using it to see which, is it all meat or just red meat, so that all the protein I need is just the size of a matchbox. Agatha, no more nyama choma. Tennyson, maybe you need to make a comment.
I can't resist making a comment. Mercy, thank you. I think that's one of the biggest puzzles that this business has to deal with. Well, let me say, we are well aware of expressions such as, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. We are aware of that because there has been arguments that it's too expensive. CBC, we are crying in Kenya about CBC, but our kids are still at school. So I think this business of animal welfare, the economics of it, which Victor has alluded to, is certainly a key question area. We haven't figured out the answer yet, but that does not mean we trade off the whole animal welfare emphasis. Education, giving people options, like you are saying, it's not about meat only the size of a matchbox keep you going. But when in Africa, your neighbor is comparing you in terms of who has status based on meat eating, that is the problem. If your neighbor has not eaten meat, you go see them. Look at those poor people. They have never eaten meat. That's what we do. So these are some of the problems. There is another saying that what you lose in the swing, you get in the roundabout. Do you know that? So what you lose in the swing in terms of high cost of buying healthy food is good health. Yeah, so this is the problem. But if you are always the person who is looking for the leftovers because you are poor, that's the problem. But we need education. And I like multidisciplinary approach. That is really where we need to go. And that's why we are talking about one welfare, all these things.
When I talked about affordability, I didn't really mean to dispute the fact that we need to consume the high welfare product. What I meant is we can see as an organization as the people that we're engaging on which area that we can be able to plug in so that everybody, all of us, they all know why we should consume this. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Mercy. I think, when your boss speaks, you don't speak after that. So I'll hand it back to Lucy.
And we leave it there and move straight to more online questions. Dr. Yamu, there are so many questions about factory farming. This factory farming, you need to decode it. You need to decode it here. I'm not sure the time we have is enough, but clearly we need more. We need more discussions on factory farming, because the next question comes from Sami Waweru. And he says that in your presentation, you said that there are no factory farms in Africa, but we still see congested animals in their housing. We still see animals not being treated fairly in the housing, especially the small-scale holder farmers. The poultry are kept in a congested cage or in congested cages. Should we say as Africa, we are not doing factory farming, yes, but we are doing it in a very small way? Hold on, another question. Okay. That's one. Mm-hmm. It seems like we are still doing factory farming, not in a bigger way, but in a sense, we are doing it in a minimal way. So, Sami, you will respond to Sami. Following up on that, he wants to know, he has just added a questionnaire. Could you please do a recap on AMR in relation to animals droppings? How the cycle from farmers using antibiotics on farms and how it gets to our food. Please do a recap of that. Yeah, and finally, still on factory farming. On factory farming, we have a question from Brenda Musimbi. Brenda Musimi. Brenda asks, what is the estimate of factory farming in Africa, and how do we transition to high welfare production systems? And during that transition, what measures need to be put in place? So what is the estimate of factory farming in Africa? How do we transition to high welfare production? And while at it, what measures do we need to put in place? So you take those three, and then we finalize with another round, and we call it a day.
Wow. I am a happy Kenyan because I have done what I am supposed to do. At least I'm sure now I'll be paid. Because I have generated a discussion, which was the idea. This was just to open the discussion so that we start looking at this thing critically and start asking the right question. And that is why I started by saying the most important slide is slide 1. So if your questions are not answered, please don't despair, just send them to us. Part of my KPIs is to ensure that all questions that are asked during engagements like this are answered. It might take a while for us to look for answers, but we'll find answers for you. Now, quickly going to Sami Waweru. No factory farms in Africa. I think, Sami, you are onto something. In fact, as an organization, beginning October, we are going to be doing serious discussions around what is the actual situation at small-scale farming. Because you realize 70% thereabout of production in Africa and Asia, the third world countries, actually in small-scale farms. So we need to understand what small-scale farms are doing and how they're handling things like antibiotic use, which is your second question, and how they're looking at things like stocking density, welfare-sensitive production system. So we are starting with a serious research that is going to cut across 4 African countries, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Zambia. Hopefully it will get into South Africa later in next year to just try and understand what are small-scale farmers doing. But I also want to agree with you, what we see in small-scale farming is actually poor welfare. It is not factory farms. Factory farm is about sizes. Yeah? What you are seeing in Africa, FAO has classified as sector 3, which is backyard poultry, 50, 100, if it goes very far, maybe 500 broiler pieces. So essentially, there's some classification that has been done by FAO that we then need to look at. Factory farms are actually classified as sector 1, high welfare, large production systems where in one chicken house, you're looking at 20, 30,000 broilers, and that's what you're looking at. So problem in Africa today, from my experience in industry, is that we have small-scale farmers, whether they're pigs or chickens, that have poor welfare production system, poor hygiene, poor biosecurity, that then causes other problems. And it's something that we want to address as we address. If you just look at the 5 fundamental freedoms and address them, you will be sorting a lot of problems. And I know that is one challenge that even industry has given us. How do we then have a level playing field where you can, the same standards that you're applying for large-scale producers in Africa is the same standard that small-scale farmers are producing at. To recap on antimicrobial resistance in relation to animal droppings, whatever you give the chicken will come out at certain levels. It actually can come out as a product, milk, eggs, etc. Or just like humans, when you give you antibiotics, you actually have to excrete it at certain level. It can come out as urine, it can come out in your droppings or feces. So all those things are critical. Now in a production system, whether it's chickens or pigs, when you use antibiotics for any reason, treatment, prophylactic, which we do not advise, there are residues that come out with the manure. Those residues, if you then use the manure on crops, then you are essentially transferring the residues from the chicken house or the pig house onto your plants. And the part of the research we are doing with Calro now is to look at that. What's the impact of that? When it rains, so that I complete the cycle, and water then runs off with some of that residues, it ends up in waterways. Then you're contaminating your aquaculture. And that is something that is currently being looked at, and that's why part of the recommendation as organization is that we need to look at this thing holistically from a One Health perspective, and very interesting things. Alternatively, because of use of antibiotics, there's selection in the gut of the animal, and you end up with antibiotic-resistant organisms. Those organisms then are excreted in the environment through manure, and again, the same process. They then can be, if you use the same manure, you then contaminate your plant products, and if there's rain runoff, you then contaminate your waterways. And that's why UNEA 5.2 becomes critical, because it's now looking at those connections from a UNEP perspective and the environment that we need to be looking at. Brenda asked about the estimate of factory farms in Africa. At this point, I would say I have no estimate. I have a rough idea that there are factory farms down south, and I have a rough idea that there are factory farms up, and research we are still looking at. But transition I can explain. I talked about something called FARMS, Farmed Animal Responsible Minimum Standards. That is what globally is being looked at, because if an organization, whether it's a producer, in fact, FARMS, for your interest, FARMS was actually generated or developed for banks, because banks wanted to understand how do we disperse money or credit to farmers. What are the things we need to be looking at? But farms then has transitioned to where producers, retailers are all looking at it, because that's how you start managing production system and driving them towards being high welfare. And if you go online, you'll find organizations, producers, retailers are beginning to make certain commitments on their website. And I said we will be launching a report called the Pecking Order that is looking at ranking all the big food organizations in Eastern Africa around their commitments in terms of some of these things, in terms of animal welfare. So the transition is about moving people from production systems that don't care about animal welfare to production systems that adhere to farmed animal responsible minimum standards. Thank you, Lucy.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yamo. Obviously, more questions on that. And I hope for David Muita, Eric Mugambi, some of the answer is included there, and you'll get the entire presentation after this. The next question, the next and the last batch of questions really is about registration and what needs to be done, Dr. Yamo. But before we go there, Ian has an answer for Ibrahim, because Ibrahim asked, and I'm sure it's one of the questions that we all have in here, is does World Animal Protection have ambassadors across Africa to promote their work? This question is from Ibrahim, all the way from Cote d'Ivoire. Ian, how do we work together with the volunteers and those of us who are seated in the room?
Thank you. Just to respond on the question by Ibrahim, considering we are only but a small team of staff that are advocating for this, and we don't have, as much as we have partners, we cannot be able to reach each and every corner of Africa physically. So we capitalize a lot on our digital platforms, that is our social media pages and also our website. We have an array of content that is very rich when it comes to food systems and animal welfare. So we encourage everyone, follow our platforms, invite your friends, your colleagues to follow our platforms. We have content that is quite enough for the continent on those platforms. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ian. And also to mention, across Africa, we run a very vibrant culture and poets. We work with Kenya National Theatre for Kenya, and we have now a partnership with Uganda. So for the other people in other countries, like Cote d'Ivoire, Ibrahim, you can reach us on our email, and we'll surely be able to connect and see how we can enhance culture and our tradition and art to really increase levels of awareness on animal welfare. And for you who is in the room here, Kenya National Theatre has, through our partnership, has something they call Poetry After Lunch. every Thursday from 2 to 4:30, you can drop in there and do a jig or a poem like what you saw on the presentation this morning. We all get it from Kenya National Theatre through that partnership. And I can see most of us are artists here, so please go in there and be part of us. Finally, final questions, Dr. Amo, before I read all the good comments. But maybe I should read these good comments from Naomi Wamaitha first to give you some encouragement. Naomi Wamaitha, this is a very good approach to protect the animal by bringing the subject of climate action on the table. She says that she commends us for the good approach to protect the animal by bringing the subject of climate action on the table. That is really looking at animal welfare and the impact to climate change. So that's good. Question from her again. She continues, Naomi Wamaitha, yes. We need strong laws if we are going to protect and conserve our animals. It's a question of registration. We need strong laws if we are going to protect and conserve our animals. Do you have any plan to introduce animal law the same way we have laws like the Child Protection Law or the Kenyan Constitution? What plans do you have in terms of registration? And that question was also echoed by Eric Mugambi and David Muita.
Okay. That's the last one.
That's the last question. Then you make your final comments and we call it.
Thank you, Naomi, David, and all those who are asking about laws and legislation around conservation or around animal welfare. Let me put it this way. As an organization, we work around lobbying and advocacy to drive the proper laws or policies that would need to be in place. From a Kenyan perspective, or let me start it rather, from an African perspective, in 2017, Africa developed what is known as the Animal Welfare Strategy for Africa, which was launched in 2017. That strategy is being used to drive animal welfare issues across regional economic communities and at national level. To give good examples, after the launch of the Animal Welfare Strategy, which is then driven around what is called APA, the African Platform for Animal Welfare, we in East Africa have tried to develop an East African policy on animal welfare. That policy then has been used to develop policies at national level. In 2018, 2019, we developed a draft policy for the National Animal Welfare Policy for Kenya. But you guys know what happens in this system. It has to go through parliament, stakeholder engagement, etc., etc. It has not gotten to a place where it has been ratified. So that's critical and important to understand. There are gaps, but there's been some work done around developing regional or national policies at certain levels. In terms of Kenya, just to then talk to Naomi, the Constitution of Kenya in Schedule 4 talks about certain aspects and actually separates certain aspects of animal welfare to what counties should do and what the national government should do. If you look at what national government should do around the 22nd bulletin, it talks about national government will develop strategy and policy for sustainable use of natural resources, especially part B, because there's an A and B. B, in terms of protection of animals and wildlife. And that is where we then anchor the animal welfare work that we do. Based on that, as an organization working with partners in animal welfare under what is called AWAKE, Animal Welfare Action Kenya, we developed a bill known as the Animal Welfare and Protection Bill. It is one of the 4 bills that is going through Parliament, and we hope that the next Parliament will be able to ratify it, driven by the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock. There is the Animal Health Bill, the Livestock Bill, Animal Welfare and Protection Bill, and the Veterinary Public Health Bill that are trying to consolidate certain pieces of laws together so that they are easy to understand. The reason why that bill came together is because currently animal welfare is managed using the Prevention of Cruelty Act, Cap 360, which was done in just around the time we got independence. And so there's been moves to then trying to modernize it and to ensure that it addresses current things. One of the things that the Animal Welfare and Protection Bill, if it's ratified, introduces is county animal welfare committees, which is currently lacking, and that would really help in ensuring that certain things are driven at county level, because Schedule 4 then gives county government certain responsibilities around animal welfare that they need to do, but currently the law is lacking, enabling legislation is lacking. And that's part of the reason why, again, we go back to the we in our mission. We need to come together and drive these processes, even as parliamentarians and governors and MCS get into place. Some of these things are the things they need to be looking at and ensuring that they ratify and they pass the relevant laws that then drive some of these things. As you heard when Tennyson was making his remarks, sometimes even our law enforcement agency are not clear what to do with some of these things, and that's why they end up going on. It's illegal, for instance, under Prevention of Cruelty Cap 360, to carry chickens hanging on a motorbike upside down. But because people are not aware, then nothing is done about it, and slowly part of the reason why we are then doing sensitization around some of these things. So these are things that we are still working on. We'd like you to engage, and I'm in my concluding remarks. We would want you to engage and be part of that process. We'd want you to go to our website, as Ian has said, and drive some of those petitions, use some of those activities, those resources on the website to then sensitize the people around you. Where you need our help, we are available. Send us an email. Let us see what we can do together, and we should be able to work for for African animals to ensure that African animals live a life worth living. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Victor. Simpigie makofi. Oh, we have one last comment from the room. Okay, so let's hear.
Thank you very much. Now, speaking as someone who's worked with an organization that practiced factory farming, I have seen all these things in place firsthand. And it's actually a big problem. These companies are under a lot of pressure financially, to the point where they overlook the welfare of the animal. I have seen animals being overdosed with antibiotics to the point of where you just have to keep them alive to sell them. You don't want to lose the animal because you lose a lot of money. The amount of money that went into bringing this animal up is going to be lost if the animal dies. So, we were at a place where you have to, administer a lot of antibiotics just to keep it alive. And then we have the third-party butchers who come in and get the animal just as it's about to die. And then this meat goes into the butcheries, into the local butcheries, while the proper meat goes into high-class or high-end supermarkets or even exported. But Kenyans are given third-class kind of meat. And that was a major concern. The issue is you cannot report it because your job is on the line. And that's where we need strong laws, strong labor laws to protect workers, where they can freely talk about this. And their employers need to know that these workers have rights and can easily talk, and they'll be protected. So again, also meat inspection. I've also had the privilege of working in high-end meat inspection factories and medium level. In the high end, I have seen so much pneumonia, whereby we had to condemn almost 80% of plaque. But the thing is, the meat passes. So you see, I know that these animals have gone through a series of antibiotics to get them to where they are, but the meat still passes. So I don't know if maybe Ministry of Health, there's a way of detecting chemicals in the meat that goes into the market. Yeah, because I know that is a big problem. And they need to really up their game because these things are still passing and going through into the markets. Then also, I think if like what you've said is the multidisciplinary action where we work with the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Agriculture. I think people need a lot of education. in terms of health, human health, if they can talk about all the disease implications, the bacterial resistance, and then once this happens, the cost of medical treatments goes up. Okay, so it affects the pocket. You have to dig deeper into your pocket, and then also lifespans are affected. They are shorter. So I guess we need to work with the Ministry of Health on that. And yeah, it's work in progress. And education, I believe, needs to happen also from a younger age in schools. I believe this needs to be a subject in schools. So by the time we leave, because our children are the future leaders. So once they get this ingrained, when they get into parliament or government, they can advocate for it. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. Total revelation there. So next time you're going to buy food, just be sure where you are buying. Okay, thank you. Just before we finish, let's do some action here. As we have said, we have a petition going on. We are asking the government to put a moratorium on factory farming in Africa. That's the petition that we are doing right now, and from here we will take it all the way to COP27 and present it there. We have also organized to meet government officials in from Africa. In any case, we have a caravan that's coming from Kenya all the way to Egypt, tentatively Kenya, Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt, and we'll be carrying that petition with us, and a memorandum that we are also working with African countries to deliver to COP27 in Egypt. So in this regard, I would want you to be part of the action. I'm sure you want to be, yeah? You want to sign this petition. For the online audience, we have the link on the comment section, comment or Q&A. So we're on the comment section. So we'll ask you to just go right there, click on that link, and sign that petition, and be sure that you'll be counted when we get to COP27 and present that petition. We are hoping to raise 50,000 petitions that we'll present there. For those of us in the room, go to Wild Animal Protection. I've seen you all have phones, really. I think there is free Wi-Fi in case you don't have data. You have phones. This is the only time you're allowed to use your phone. So look for Wild Animal Protection. That is wildanimalprotection.or.ke. A lot of people ask me why or.ke. It's because we are an Africa-wide organization. So go to wildanimalprotection.or.ke. Next. Ian.
Sorry. So on the menu, we do have a drop-down where we have written take action. On the actions, the very first action, ask your government to put or set up a moratorium on factory farms, or you will find creating a new world for animals. So please click on that link. At the bottom, there's a link where you can sign that petition, add in your details, click sign petition, and you will have done a really amazing action towards seeing a world where animals live free from cruelty and suffering. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Mmesign, eh? How many of us have signed? Oh, all of us have signed. Thank you. You are now part of Wild Animal Protection. As we said, there's a movement of people who are making a better change for animals. Yeah, so we are coming to the end of this. And I just want to read one message from Khadija. And I want to appreciate first each one of you for joining us online, physical. Your presence here has been something that we don't take for granted. You are indeed part of the people who are really making a difference in the planet. When I was coming in, somebody asked me, what problem are we solving? I'm sure now as you leave this room, you know which problem we are solving, right? Yes, we are creating a better planet for animals and a better planet for humanity. And we end with a remark from Dr. Khadija Chepkorir. She says, I like the take-home message on what we can do. We can eat less meat and eat better. Let's eat less and eat better. And that's how we wind up here at Wild Animal Protection, the launch of this report. So go out and do good, eat less, eat better. Thank you.